Good day. Well, I'm making this video today on the single topic of the end or apparent end of the battle over the Azovstal factory in Mariupol. I say apparent end because it's not completely clear, even as I'm making this program, precisely what is going on. Perhaps I can reconstruct events as I can see them, though I should say that what I'm going to discuss, what I'm going to describe, is something that I've put together from various sources. I'm not going to provide date times because it's very difficult to in this scenario. But anyway, I'm going to give what I understand to have been the sequence of events, which is that this mass surrender of Ukrainian troops at the Azovstal factory appears to have begun early yesterday. There were initial reports that around 10 Ukrainian troops had appeared with white flags at the Azovstal factory and had in effect surrendered to the Russians. Then we got more reports that more Ukrainian troops in the Azovstal factory were surrendering and were bringing out wounded who were being handed over to the Russians for medical care. Now, these reports, these very early reports of what was happening, and I want to stress these were mainly Russian reports that I was seeing. Ukrainian reports were much slower in confirming what was going on at Azovstal, but these early Russian reports appeared to suggest that these were impromptu surrenders decided upon by the soldiers themselves. In other words, they'd not received an order to surrender from the higher authorities in Kiev or even from the command elements within the Azovstal factory itself. And I got further reports which suggested that the Ukrainian soldiers who were surrendering yesterday, or at least the initial group of soldiers that was surrendering yesterday, were soldiers from one of the more isolated parts of the factory complex, which is huge, 11 square kilometers allegedly, and that they were unconnected. They were not directly connected to the main group and were making these decisions alone and by themselves. So that was what appeared to be happening, that this group of soldiers, isolated, coming under relentless bombardment, running short of ammunition, running short of food, with wounded around them, took a spontaneous decision by themselves to surrender to the Russians. However, the fact of the surrender of these troops may, according to these early reports that I saw, have had a cascade effect, and there were reports that other troops, other Ukrainian troops, or other parts of the factory complex followed the example of these troops who had earlier surrendered and chose to surrender themselves. And then I got further reports that the authorities in Kiev were hearing about the fact that some kind of a surrender process was underway at the Mariupol factory, and there were also reports circulating at around that time that the Russian command was in touch with the command of the Ukrainian force in Azovstal, and that the command in Azovstal, having realized that the process of surrender of Ukrainian troops in the Azovstal factory was acquiring its own momentum, that the command in the Azovstal factory decided that rather than lose all control of the situation, they would then decide to give a general order to cease fighting and to surrender. Well, when the authorities in Kiev heard this, they too decided that they needed to step in to prevent it appearing as if these soldiers were surrendering without instructions from Kiev. And so we got the decision from Kiev to the troops at the Azovstal factory to surrender. Now, that seems to me to be the correct sequence of events. I want to stress I was getting this from Russian reports, but I was getting these Russian reports as the events were taking place. In other words, this is not a narrative that was constructed after the surrender announcement, and it seems to me that that gives it greater credibility, and it makes it more plausible. Now, the Ukrainian authorities, for some hours, appeared to suggest that this wasn't actually a surrender at all, that it was an agreed evacuation of these troops from the Azovstal factory, and that this had presumably been agreed in some way with the Russians. There were suggestions that there would be a prisoner swap or something of this kind, and that these people would find their way back to Ukraine. And President Zelensky himself spoke about the importance of protecting, ensuring the lives of these people, and that this was in fact an evacuation, some kind of planned evacuation. And quite remarkably, the Western media, almost to a newspaper and television station and website, went along with that story. So for several hours, I was reading about an evacuation from the Azovstal factory. In reality, and in fact, as the Russians have made absolutely clear, this was an unconditional surrender. There were no terms of surrender agreed. The Russians apparently told the Ukrainians, and have been saying to the Ukrainians for some time, that the only acceptable way to end the fighting in Azovstal, at least on the Russian point of view, was for the Ukrainian troops at Azovstal to surrender, and if they did not, the Russians would continue the campaign against Azovstal until all the troops at the Azovstal factory had either been killed or captured. So this, according to the Russians, is an unconditional surrender. Now, over the course of the following hours, as this has become increasingly clear, that all the Ukrainian troops who are surrendering at Azovstal are being sent to facilities in Russian-controlled territory, or to be more precise, to the Donetsk People's Republic, and are going to be held there. And as it's also become increasingly clear that Ukrainian assertions to the contrary, there is no agreed prisoner exchange for these surrendered soldiers. I've noticed that over the course of the last few hours, at least the British media has started to change its reporting of the story, so that, for example, The Guardian is now referring to the surrender of the Ukrainian troops in Azovstal using the word surrender rather than evacuation, and is acknowledging that there is no actual agreement for a prisoner exchange, making it far from clear that all of these Ukrainian soldiers will indeed be returned to Ukraine. Now, the reason for my doubt at the start of this program that this means that the fighting at Azovstal is in fact conclusively at an end is because, if I am correct in my analysis of this information that we were getting from Azovstal over the course of the day, if I'm correct in thinking that this was a surrender decision which started from decisions made by some of the soldiers at the Azovstal factory, it is conceivable that there might still be some determined, resolute, fanatical, if you prefer, fighters at the Azovstal factory who are going to refuse to surrender and are going to refuse to take the instructions from Kiev, and who will try to hold out in the factory a little longer. I'm not saying definitely that that's going to happen, but so far the information that one is hearing is that around 300 soldiers and wounded have surrendered from the factory, but possibly the bulk of the Ukrainian troops may, as at the time of the making of this video, still be there. Anyway, regardless of that, it's, I think, indisputable that this fight over the Azovstal steelworks is all but over. Even if some of the troops, the Ukrainian troops, do still try to hold out, and that's debatable, it can't be for very much longer. I mean, they would presumably become increasingly isolated. They would be disobeying orders from their own high command. I would expect that they would be forced either to surrender or be eliminated one way or the other within the next few hours. So where does this leave us? Where does this collapse of resistance in the Azovstal factory leave us? Well, the first thing to say is that the Battle of Mariupol is now well and conclusively over. And it's important to say that this has been the biggest single battle of the Ukraine war so far. I mean, there was lots of fighting around Kiev, but that, when you analyze the fighting that took place around Kiev, it never actually expanded into more than certain skirmishes. There is an ongoing battle in Donbass, which is on a bigger scale than the battle at Mariupol. But the single biggest fight, the single biggest isolated fight, is the one that has taken place in Mariupol. And it is clear that it has ended in a clear-cut and conclusive Russian victory. Now, we've been hearing a great deal about Ukrainian victories, some real, some fictional, over the course of this war. But the single biggest win by either side in this war, by far, is the one that has just happened in Mariupol, and it is a Russian win. The Russians have destroyed a large military formation of the Ukrainian army, which was garrisoning Mariupol. There's disputes about how large it was. Some say up to 20,000. The Russians themselves say that at the time when they fully encircled the city, that had fallen to 8,500. The Ukrainians put it much less at 3,500, a figure, by the way, which I don't believe for all kinds of reasons. But regardless, the fact is that this is a large concentration of Ukrainian troops holding on to an important city for Ukraine. Now, the reason Mariupol is important is not just because it's one of the biggest cities in the Donbass. It's also because this was the center of Ukraine's steel industry, steel being a major export for Ukraine. It is also, by the way, the product that Ukraine uses to make its tanks and its weapons. This is perhaps an obvious point, but to the extent that Ukraine had an arms industry, which it did, and to a significant degree, it depended on steel, much of which, around half of which apparently, was produced at in Mariupol, much of it at the Azovstal works. And of course, it was also a port city on the Sea of Azov. Now, what that means is that Mariupol was a key part of Ukraine's economic complex. Its conclusive loss now means that Ukraine has lost one of its most important economic assets, and it may find it very difficult to reconstitute itself as an industrial economic power following the loss of Mariupol and what that means for the wider loss in Donbass. So that's one thing to say. But of course, there are other implications to this. Firstly, there is an important psychological aspect. One of the reasons why the Ukrainian government has been pretending that this was not a surrender but an evacuation, that these troops are being evacuated from the Azovstal steelworks, that they will all eventually return to Ukraine. One of the reasons it's doing that is because, most unwisely, in my opinion, the Ukrainian government has built up the reputation of these troops who have been fighting in the Azovstal steelworks. There's actual claims that they are comparable to the Spartan soldiers who fought, the 300 Spartans who fought and died at Thermopylae. They've been built up into heroes. And much of this heroic narrative that's connected to these soldiers is on the basis that they would not surrender, that they go on fighting to the very bitter end, that surrender for them was not an option. Well, they have surrendered. And Kiev, of course, says that it's ordered their surrender. But however way you spin it, this is clearly a surrender of these warriors. Now, this reminds me, I've said this in previous programs, very much of the way in which Ukraine described back in 2015 the Ukrainian soldiers who were fighting in Donetsk airport and who were trying to defend Donetsk airport from the forces of the Donetsk People's Republic. And there was lots of talk at that time about how these were heroic, invincible soldiers, how they would never surrender. Ukraine often spoke about them as being comparable to cyborgs, people who couldn't be killed easily. They would go on fighting to the very bitter end. And when on the contrary, the airport was captured by the forces of the Donetsk People's Republic, and when the so-called cyborgs proved to be nothing of the kind, proved to be instead human beings, this caused a severe blow to Ukrainian morale. And the fact that Ukraine itself is clearly worried that the same thing might happen with these soldiers is shown by the fact that the Ukrainian government has come up with this elaborate fiction that these soldiers haven't surrendered at all or haven't been ordered to surrender, that this is some sort of evacuation, and that these soldiers have managed somehow to hold off the Russians and never surrendered but went on fighting until the Russians presumably were forced to agree to their evacuation to Ukraine. Well, this, as I said, elaborate story, to my mind, shows again the extent to which Ukraine overcommitted itself, it overinvested in the heroic narrative concerning these soldiers. And I'm going to say something about this, which is that I think that constructing heroic narratives around soldiers is in some ways a very dangerous thing, because it creates expectations which can then become demands that put soldiers who are risking their lives in impossible positions. Now, what I mean by this is the following. Ukraine is trying to claim that the fight of the soldiers at the Azovstal steelworks somehow played a critical role in the war. It meant that the Russians weren't able to concentrate on capturing the important city of Zaporozhye, which is further north. There is actually no evidence at all that the Russians had any immediate plans to capture Zaporozhye. This is pure guess. It may be that the Russians had such a plan, but there's no public information that would lead one to think so. And in fact, there are all sorts of reasons why I actually personally doubt that the Russians did have any plans to capture Zaporozhye, just as I personally doubt that the Russians have had many plans up to now, up to very recently, to capture any big Ukrainian cities. So I certainly don't think that the defense of Azovstal has saved Zaporozhye in any way. And I'm going to go even further. Given that the Russians had apparently captured pretty much all of what might be called usable Mariupol by the middle of April, it became debatable why these troops at the Azovstal steelworks were being asked to keep on fighting. After all, there's no evidence that they were pinning down large numbers of Russian troops in Mariupol. the Pentagon itself confirmed that most of the assault forces, the strike forces that the Russians had deployed to Mariupol, were being transferred away from that city way back in April, and they've gradually been deployed elsewhere in Donbass, where they are participating in the major fighting in Donbass. The forces that were left in Mariupol were an overwatch force backed by heavy artillery and bombers, but in no sense were the Russians being pinned in Mariupol in the way that the Ukrainians are saying. So the only reason why these soldiers were kept fighting was because this false narrative of heroism was constructed around them. I can't help but think that these soldiers were essentially asked to go on fighting long beyond the point where this served any actual military logic or utility, because the Ukrainian government couldn't bring itself to admit that the narrative of heroism that had been constructed around these soldiers was ultimately flawed and was not based upon the actual military realities. That is not to dispute the courage of these soldiers, but men have courage. Heroes in Greek literature are not men, they're not human beings, they are semi-divine people. So they work with something more than courage. And to be straightforward about it, the soldiers in the Azovstal steelworks were not heroes, they were very brave men. So their lives were being put at risk in order to sustain a fictitious narrative that had no basis in reality. And anybody, Ukrainian, Russian, any human being, I think, looking at this decision by these Ukrainian soldiers to surrender, and looking at the decision by the authorities in Kiev either to support their surrender or to order it, must feel a huge sense of relief that this nightmare at Mariupol and the Azovstal steelworks of these troops being trapped underground in caverns, in these awful bunkers, as the bombs and shells fell around them, as they ran out of food, as they were probably disconnected from electricity supply, much of the time would have been in darkness, in malodorous, terrible conditions, that this horror is now at an end. Now, what will become of these troops? The Russians have said that many of these troops belong to the Azov force, and that seems to be incontrovertible. The Azov force is one which the Russians and much of the world, and myself, by the way, also consider to be a deeply ideological, ultra-right unit. The Russians accuse it of committing war crimes. I'm sure that they will filter through to find out whether any of these prisoners have in fact been involved in those crimes. But it is not inconceivable that in time any of these soldiers who are just seen to be soldiers could be exchanged for Russian prisoners in Ukrainian hands. But that will be something that will happen eventually. It is not something that has been agreed now. There is no reason to think that any of these troops will be subjected to any cruel or unusual punishments or other indignities that may amount to actual war crimes. Now, this brings, as I said, the Battle of Mariupol to an end. The Russians now have a secure land corridor between Donbass and Crimea. This has been much talked about. The Russians have achieved it, and that must have been one of their objectives in the war. The other objective, obviously, that we know about, the Russians may have other objectives. There's been speculations that they might want eventually to recapture Kharkiv, that they might want to take Odessa, that they might want to take the city they call Dnipropetrovsk, though the Ukrainians call it Dnipro. that they might even want to move further west than that. There's all these speculations, but these are pure speculations. So far, the Russians have only spoken about this land corridor to Crimea and to Donbass as well. And the battle for Donbass continues even as I speak. And all the indications are that it is going Russia's way. Now, it's difficult to get a detailed and exact picture of what precisely is happening, but I hear of more and more Ukrainian troops being encircled in places like Liman and indeed in the larger town of Severodonetsk, of Ukrainian counteroffensives against the major Russian grouping in ETHEREUM being repelled. I'm even hearing reports now that the Ukrainian counteroffensive in northeast Kharkiv, which we were hearing so much about and which I've discussed in previous programs, well, that now apparently is going into reverse, and that the Ukrainians are finding it very difficult to hold on to some of the territory that they regained, and that they might actually be pushed out of it. Well, all of the indications are that we could start to see fairly soon some sort of crumbling of Ukrainian forces in northern Donbass. I've discussed this in previous programs, but the news that's been trickling out from the battlefields over the course of the day strengthens that perception. So, perhaps what Ukraine ought to be doing is sitting down with the Russians, not just negotiating exchanges of prisoners, but resuming those detailed negotiations that Ukraine seemed to be preparing to undertake at the Istanbul meeting back in March, but from which following pressure and promises of help from the United States and Britain, the Ukrainians backed off from. That's, in my opinion, what Ukraine should do. And I'm hearing reports that some of the European states, namely Germany, France, and Italy, also have now come round to the view that a negotiated solution to this war is essential. Apparently, that was what Olaf Scholz partly spoke to President Putin and then subsequently President Zelensky about. Now, negotiation is going to be incredibly difficult. The Russians may very well feel that with Ukraine having gone back on much that it promised in Istanbul, it can't be trusted again, and the Russians, at the very least, are likely to crank up their demands. But it does seem to me that if losses like those we've just seen in Mariupol are to be avoided, as if those negotiations need to begin immediately. I was dismayed to see a Ukrainian official say that the negotiations between Ukraine and Russia are essentially suspended. I think Ukraine needs to unsuspend them fast. The Russians are in the process of gaining control of Donbass. I think they've already got their land corridor to Crimea. They're in control of Kherson region. They seem to be taking the first steps to have Kherson either declare independence of Ukraine or indeed to unite with Russia. The two republics of the Donbass, the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics, seem to be moving in the same direction. If the war continues, then it's likely that the Russians will probably want to consolidate their control of Kharkiv and Zaporozhye regions at the very least. And of course, with every day that continues, Ukraine loses more men, it loses more equipment, its economy goes further down. It's, as I said, lost Mariupol, the center of its steel industry. And I think Ukraine would be extremely well advised not to assume that these promises of Western aid are going to actually make any material difference to the outcome of the war. Will Ukraine follow that advice? Will the Ukrainians learn the lesson of Mariupol, that trapping yourself into narratives of heroism and victory rather than facing the realities, treating your own soldiers as human beings, not asking them to do that which is beyond human limits? Will the Ukrainians learn that? Will they learn also that looking to others for help and trusting in their offers of help, looking, in other words, beyond your own power, is never a wise thing to do, especially for a country that is involved in an existential conflict with a much more powerful adversary? What will the Ukrainians do? Will they sit down? Will they negotiate? Will they go back to what they were appearing to be ready to do in Istanbul? For me, this is now the big question, because I have no doubt at all that in the next few weeks, Donbass will be fully Russian. And then, if the war continues, despite all the promises of Western help, despite all the dribbles of guns and other weapon systems that Ukraine has been promised, I suspect that all that will do is cause the Russians to crank up both their demands on the Ukraine and to upgrade their special military operation, as they call it, in which case Ukraine could lose first perhaps Kharkiv and Odessa, then perhaps also Zaporozhye and Dnipro, and eventually all that's left. Well, that's where I leave this program today. I hope you've learned something. Though, as I said, the news from Mariupol is global news now. Thank you for joining me again today. Remember, you can join us on Rumble and Locals. And if you're watching our programs on Rumble, if you press the red maroon button at the top of the video, that will take you directly to our Locals homepage, where I do my live streams exclusively on Locals every Wednesday at 1400 hours Eastern Standard Time. And we're also broadcasting on multiple other platforms, the new free speech platform SuperU, ODYSEE. We have our own Telegram channel. We're present in many places, and you can easily find us, links under this video. Last but not least, you can support us via Patreon and Subscribestar. You can go to our shop and buy the amazing things there, the hats, the hoodies, the sweatshirts, the t-shirts, the magic mugs, and of course you can also support us by ticking the like button if you've liked this video, and by checking your subscription to the channel. Thank you very much for joining me again today. I look forward to you joining me again soon, and have a very good day until then.